Welcome to Cybersecurity Sense, a weekly podcast providing updates and insight into the latest in cybersecurity. Brought to you by LBMC Information Security. Now, here's your host.
Hi, I'm Bill Dean, shareholder here at LBMC Information Security. Thank you for joining us again, and we hope you enjoy this content as much as the previous content. As in the past, we will again have a special guest on based on their expertise. For this episode, our guest will be Stewart, that is our Director of Technical Services. Before we get into the substance of the topic, being specific to PCI pen testing compared to normal pen testing, I just want to thank Stewart for taking the time to speak with us today. Stewart, if you don't mind, can you maybe take a minute or two and kind of give us some background? How long have you been here? Kind of your roles and responsibilities?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. I am, as you mentioned, the Director of Technical Services. I'm also what you'd probably consider our lead QSA. So I spend a lot of my time doing PCI assessments and kind of managing our PCI team. I'm also heavily involved with our pen testing team. And so that really helps me kind of bridge that gap between with our clients and what they need to do for a PCI specific pen test. I've been with LBMC for, it's been 15 years and started, again, a long time ago and was actually here when we first started our PCI practice. And I've been able to see it grow to what it is today.
That's awesome. Thank you. So been with us for 15 years. As most of the listeners know, I think I've been here since 2016. So 15 years, I guess you started when you were like 18, 20, something like that?
I wish, Bill.
Well, thank you for that. So, as you mentioned, you've been involved in leading the majority of our pen tests, and with especially on the PCI side of things for our engagements. Our clients really appreciate your expertise being someone of our lead QSA. So, with that, let's go ahead and get into the topic of PCI pen tests. So, there is a lot of confusion in the industry between what a vulnerability assessment is and a penetration test. Not only when it comes to PCI, just overall, it's really hard to describe that sometimes. So we could do a podcast just for that. But in your opinion, what are the differences between a vulnerability assessment and what a true penetration test is?
Good question, Bill. And we do see this occasionally, especially with mid-sized companies and sometimes with larger companies as well. But a vulnerability scan is really something that is done with a software tool exclusively. There are several kind of name brand vulnerability assessment tools out there. Qualys and Tenable are really the two big ones out there. And a vulnerability scan is generally when somebody is running those types of tools against an environment to determine what types of vulnerabilities it detects. But that's really where a vulnerability scan ends, is that, hey, I detected something and you should probably take a look at it. Contrast that with a penetration test, which is something that might take a vulnerability scan as one of its inputs, but it's also going to take many other types of tests and is very much more reliant on the knowledge of the person behind the keyboard to take input and then actually try to demonstrate that a vulnerability is present. And so that's really the big difference between those two. A penetration test is going to take a vulnerability scan and take it to the next level. A vulnerability scan would never be able to demonstrate that you got to, into someone's email or you were able to get to XYZ data by chaining together different things. It's just going to tell you kind of on the surface that there might be a problem.
That's a great explanation. So to kind of summarize, so a vulnerability assessment is mainly automated tools and it's finding the low-hanging fruit, whereas a true penetration test is really depending on the expertise and the skill of the actual tester that can take that information and actually do something with it other than patching a system or something similar to that.
Yes, Bill, I'd agree with that.
Cool. And so from what I understand, I'm not a QSA, but I'm a PCIP, but the PCI data standards require both vulnerability scans and pen testing of companies of their environments from a PCI perspective. A company is required to conduct both the external and the internal vuln scans, as well as doing the penetration tests, based on what I understand. So we perform hundreds of penetration tests, probably on an annual basis, across most industries to meet various objectives. What are the more common objectives that you see from a PCI pen test perspective compared to a normal type of penetration test?
So The PCI Council has got some fairly specific objectives that companies in the pen testing companies that they hire should be trying to accomplish as part of a PCI specific pen test. The biggest of which is that the primary goal, or one of the primary goals of a pen test that's for PCI compliance purposes, should always be: can I, as a pen tester, gain access to credit card data or systems that have got credit card data on them? That's really should be the ultimate goal of the pen testers and of the agreement between the company and the pen testing firm is to demonstrate that or not. That's really why the PCI Council has companies do pen test, is to demonstrate yes or no. Can someone gain access to the environment? The other big thing that a PCI pen test should be doing for an organization is demonstrating segmentation controls that might be in place within an organization. Many organizations that have to comply with PCI compliance choose to segment their networks to reduce scope, and that could be an entire conversation in itself. But that that other main goal of a PCI specific pen test should be to also demonstrate whether those segmentation controls from a technical standpoint are in place, or how easily the segmentation controls could be bypassed.
So in many of our penetration tests, depending on the industry, our goal is to obtain, domain admin access or get access to sensitive information. So if a client were to present that penetration testing report for PCI purposes, would that be valid? Would that be sufficient as to what you would be looking for?
So as a QSA, I would not accept that as a valid pen test. When I look at pen tests that were done by really anybody else besides us, the things that I'm looking for is the fact that the pen test had, as part of its scope, doesn't have to be the only scope, but as part of the scope, those two things I just mentioned are mentioned, right? Was one of the objectives trying to gain access to the cardholder data environment, and was there any mention of segmentation testing? Segmentation testing is technically not required, and so that may or may not be applicable. But as the QSA of during an engagement, we would know that, and so it is very, very common that that's the case. So if those things weren't mentioned in the pen testing report, we would definitely go back to the client and ask for clarification. And in some cases, it's rare, but in some cases, we've had to tell the clients that their engagement did not meet the requirements for PCI.
Well, and you've kind of touched on it. So just to be direct with the question, so what are some of the key differences when it comes to performing a penetration test for PCI compliance? Objectives, scope, frequency. You've mentioned cardholder data environment. Kind of define that a little bit for those that may not be familiar with it. But, a PCI pen test is much like a standard pen test in a lot of ways. Let's kind of differentiate the differences between them and what you're looking for compared to what is a typical pen test.
Sure, and you're right. A pen test is a pen test is a pen test in many ways, right? The techniques and tools are generally the same, but the word pen test is can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, a PCI specific pen test really should always be a collaborative approach. It should never be a black box only test. Here at LBMC, as you know, Bill, we call that a gray box test. There's collaboration. The client should be providing the pen testers with information on where their CDE is, and I'll explain what a CDE is here in a minute. Where are there systems that are actually storing card data, if any? Where are they connected to systems? How do they go about legitimately accessing that environment? These are important things that a pen tester who's doing a PCI specific pen test need to know in order to meet that objective of trying to gain access to cardholder data. As many clients have got very complex, large environments, and if a pen tester is not giving some specifics, there's a chance that they may never discover, just through sheer lack of time, the specifics that the pen test objective needs to have. And so it should always be a collaborative approach. PCI does require them to happen once a year. As I mentioned before, the review of segmentation of the CDE should be in place, and that's really basically showing where organization has got controls, typically firewall controls in place that prevent out of scope areas. And then a lot of organizations they want their corporate network to be out of scope, basically demonstrating that there is no connectivity into the CDE from what they deem to be an out of scope area. Another unique feature about a PCI pen test is that if you're a service provider, and it's basically someone who is interacting with credit card data, but on someone else's behalf, the PCI Council says that you still need to do a pen test once a year, but you also need to do a segmentation test every 6 months. And so that's a unique kind of above and beyond requirement that the PCI Council has for service providers. The logic there is that if you're involved with credit card data for multiple companies, your risk is higher than it would be for just a merchant who's trying to protect their own credit card data. And therefore, the PCI Council says they need to do that extra step of once every 6 months validating that segmentation between the CDE and the non-CDE environment. So I mentioned that I'd kind of explain what the CDE is. And so that's an acronym that stands for the Cardholder Data Environment. In simpler terms, that's really just the systems that are storing, processing, or transmitting credit card data. Those are the ones that if a hacker got onto, they in theory could steal credit card data. You can think about it this way, right? There's many systems in an environment, but not all of them are going to have as much value to a hacker. And so the ones that are actually doing, the processing of credit card data would be considered the CDE.
And that's the safe that everybody's looking to protect. I mean, most of our PCI clients are going to be someone that's handling a lot of credit cards. That's where it's all stored. And so that's why they need to protect that a little bit better. Is that what I understand?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned the requirement to conduct the penetration test once a year. Kind of going back to the vulnerability assessments, there is a requirement that they still have to do their own vulnerability assessments, I think quarterly, plus the penetration test. What other types of situations would prompt them to have to do a penetration test more than once a year? Is it a huge change in the infrastructure, or what do you see in there?
Yeah, Bill. So the PCI Council says kind of, that once a year pen test is kind of a minimum standard. There's also requirements and wordings that talk about conducting penetration tests when there's a significant change in your environment. And the council doesn't define what that significant change is. That's something that each organization should be interpreting on their own. But the idea here is that if you're going to make major changes that could affect the security of your cardholder data environment, that a pen test is probably warranted. A new pen test is warranted out of cycle to validate that all the controls are still in place. A good example would be, moving your environment from on-prem to AWS, or changing out your firewall, or changing the architecture of your CDE environment. Those are all things that would, in my opinion, warrant a kind of an extra pen test to take place.
Thank you for that, Stewart. So, in your experience in doing this for a very long time, what are some of the common mistakes or issues that you've seen when clients ask for a PCI pen test? Where are some of the stumbling blocks? Where are some of the challenges that you have to meet the client's expectations?
Yeah, Bill. So, PCI's been around a long time, but we still see many clients struggle with some of the understandings of what a PCI pen test is compared to a normal pen test. And the biggest mistakes we see is really lack of understanding. A lack of understanding of what their PCI scope, right? So what systems should be targeted as part of a pen test, at least as the PCI piece of the pen test, as well as a lack of understanding between what the difference is between what the CDE is and what connected to systems are. And this is something that many companies struggle with, but it's really important to be able to communicate to a pen tester as part of a PCI pen test. I'll give you a great example. It is common that an organization will provide us with a large listing of all of their systems that are in scope for PCI. And again, not to get too into the weeds on this because it could be a conversation itself, but as I mentioned before, not all PCI systems are created equal. There's systems that are actually got credit card data on them or flowing through the CDE, and then there's systems that kind of support them. You can think of those as your patching server or your monitoring server. Those systems, while are important, don't directly contain cardholder data or don't have it contained over them, and therefore the risk is lower. But if the pen tester is given both those systems in one big list, they might think that gaining access to the patch management server is as of a significant finding as them getting access to the database that a million credit card records is on, and it's not. And there would be different consequences in terms of remediation depending on that. And so it's really critical that a pen tester understands that, and that those types of systems are differentiated within the documentation that is provided to them.
Definitely. And thank you for that, Stewart. So, we've talked about on-premise systems and CDEs, and, we've spoken about, moving to cloud, whether AWS or Azure. A lot of the PCI clients that we work with, they're retailers and they're doing a lot of online types of transactions. So how do the web applications kind of play into this compared to the CDE environment, or, where does it bleed over? What does that look like? And how should they be addressing that if they're storing, processing credit cards?
Sure. So again, just in terms of the rules, the PCI standards separately require that organizations that are taking credit card data over the web, as you mentioned, typically, through some type of e-commerce web application, that those systems are separately tested specifically for a web application assessment in that requirement. And it's in, the requirement 6 area. It basically gives organizations a choice. They can conduct an annual specific web application assessment or pen test of that application, or they can put in a web application firewall. And so organizations have the choice to do that, either one of those. Now, that is a separate requirement from the pen test. Organizations that have this e-commerce application or similar are still required to do a full pen test. And that pen test should always include web application testing as part of it. And so again, it's important for the pen tester to understand what those URLs are that are the ones that are part of the CDE and the ones that are processing credit card data. However, the big difference between those is really that the depth that the pen tester goes to as part of the pen test. Within a standard pen test, web application controls would be tested, but it's not going to go into the depth that is required in that requirement 6 section that talks about doing a specific web application assessment. In those cases, the pen tester really should be doing a deep dive. If there's some type of authentication mechanism, the client should be providing some types of logins for the tester to test deeper than the application.
Well, you bring up a really good point there. So as both you and I know, there's 2 different levels of doing web application tests. There's the unauthenticated, which is someone that's just on the internet. And then there's the authenticated, which means you're in the application. So from the web application firewall perspective, I can see a lot of protections from the unauthenticated perspective. Do you think that's enough of and I'm going to use a PCI term, a compensating control for authenticated types of testing? Or would you suggest that maybe the clients look at the authenticated testing also?
If an organization is relying on a web application assessment to meet that requirement 6, I think it's 6.5, 6.6 requirement, and it has the capability to do authentication, those tests should always be done with authentication. A standard pen test does not necessarily need to have authentication credentials provided as part of that test.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate that explanation. So, Stewart, compared to typical penetration tests that we perform on a frequent basis, the remediation schedule for a non-compliance type of test is a little bit lax. It's pretty much when the organization decides this is when we can dedicate the resources needed to remediate these issues. How's PCI different when it comes to remediation, and how are they expecting our clients to handle that?
So when an organization has significant exploitable findings as part of their PCI pen test, the PCI standards require that those specific items are remediated and retested in order to be compliant and pass PCI. So in many cases, an organization will conduct a PCI pen test that is also kind of part of a larger pen test that has got elements that are not in scope for PCI. And so the elements that were specifically designated as PCI issues, and again, that were significant and exploitable, have to be remediated and retested in order for the QSA to pass that control.
And that's somewhat up to the penetration testing team to differentiate between what is PCI and what is not PCI. So hopefully the reports would be very clear as to these are the things you really need to worry about now. These are the other things that may fall into a different type of remediation schedule. Is that a safe statement?
It is, and it's really important for organizations who are hiring pen testers to make sure that their pen testers are designating what items that they deem to be significant findings and need to be remediated over those that do not, because we do see that sometimes. And so on the QSA side of things, if we see a pen test and it doesn't distinguish between those two, the assumption has to be that all the exploitable findings should be remediated. And that's not always the case. And it can cause the organization kind of just some extra work and kind of heartache to do that. So it's really important that when you're working with your pen tester, that it's clear in the reporting what is that significant finding, what actually needs to be remediated to meet PCI compliance, and what doesn't.
And thank you for that. So before I move on to the next question, a lot of retailers, most of the people listening, whether they're clients or consumers, they're probably seeing a technology, whether they realize or not. It's called P2Ps. So a lot of our clients are doing that at the pad. Can you kind of explain what P2P is and how it impacts our clients' requirements for PCI? If you can do that somewhat quickly. I realize that could be a podcast in itself, but just a real quick explanation of what P2PE is.
Sure, but be happy to. So P2PE is an acronym for the term point-to-point encryption. And I'm not going to get into all the details of official point-to-point versus not, but essentially it's technology that allows an organization to drastically reduce their scope. The technology that takes place is essentially encrypting credit card data on the actual card swipe device, and therefore making it somewhat useless to hackers. And so the PCI Council has said that if you as an organization have got that in place, and again, there's a lot more details here, but to simplify things, if you've got that in place, you don't need to do many of the other PCI controls that other organizations do. And one of those is a pen test. And so you are not required to do a pen test if your environment is a P2PE environment.
Well, and kind of going out on a limb here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the credit card breaches that we've been impacted by or read about was something using, memory scrapers. Because when customer swipes the card, it's in memory for a period of time, and the attackers grab that. And that's how a lot of these larger data breaches have occurred. My understanding is that P2PE, because it's encrypted from the swipe all the way to the processor, eliminates that concern for the most part. Is that a safe assumption?
It is. That's the main concept of P2P is that even if memory scrapers were on the point of sale systems, they're only going to be stealing encrypted card data that, in theory, could not be decrypted by the attacker.
Got it. So you mentioned that some retailers are, that have P2PE all the way, that reduces their PCI scope. What does that look like from our clients? How are they handling that? And are they just minimizing the penetration test, or are they doing different types of things to help improve their environment?
Yeah, so a lot of times when we've got clients that have converted from a kind of a more full scope environment to the P2P environment, a lot of times they still do the pen test, but it just doesn't have to be specifically for PCI compliance, and some of the obligations like having to do the remediation, right away to pass, don't apply. So we see a lot of companies that still want to do that because, as a pen test has got other benefits besides just checking the box for compliancy. And so we really see a lot of clients just still choosing to do it. We also have clients that maybe want to take a hybrid approach since they, again, don't have that compliance burden for the pen test, but they still, again, want to get some value. And so we're seeing a lot of clients who are choosing to do purple teaming. That's kind of a collaborative, quasi pen test where we as the pen testers come in, work with the organization's SOC team and incident response team to kind of flesh out where organizations might have blind spots to common attack scenarios, and a variety of other things. But we generally see companies even if they're not required to do it, choose to do some type of engagement for their security. Because as we all know, compliance and security are not the same thing.
Definitely. Thank you for that. So that's awesome. So, Stewart, if you had a crystal ball, how would you see PCI pen tests evolving over the next few years? We've touched on quite a few things, but I mean, what would you see happening over the next 2 to 3 years? Realizing there's some new standards coming out quite often, how does that change how pen tests are going to look moving forward?
Yeah, and I'll have to look at my crystal ball here. I wish I had one, but to me, the biggest thing I see coming the next couple of years is a little more clarity around how social engineering and more specifically, phishing, email phishing, is required on pen tests. So today, there is no hard requirement that an organization has to do phishing as part of their external penetration test. And as hopefully all of you listening to this podcast know, that that's generally the number one risk to an organization in terms of getting hacked is having somebody get phished, have those credentials or their computer compromised, and then gaining access to the rest of the environment or data systems. And that's not something that has to happen during a PCI pen test. And so I do see in the future that the council will make that a little bit harder of a stance.
Well, and one glad thing I'm happy to state is we include that as the majority of our PCI pen tests, even if the client, if it's not even part of the scope, we suggest that for that very purpose. So maybe we're a little bit ahead of the curve on that. So, Stewart, thank you so much for your time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just thanks for having me on. And a pen test is an important part of PCI and really security as a whole. And I hope that some of these ideas are help other people make sure that their pen test is successful and reduces their risk.
I'm sure it's going to, Stewart. I learned quite a bit, even though I'm involved with it heavily. So I guess in closing, thank you to everyone for listening. Tune in next time for our next episode. As always, if you have a particular topic that you'd like to hear on this podcast, please contact me at bdean@lbmc.com. To learn more about LBMC Security and the services we provide, please visit lbmcsecurity.com and have a great week.